So we are gathering. Perhaps we'll wait another minute or two to see people coming in from. I see people coming in from the hall. As Bob Skidelsky was saying, we're a bit of a victim of the staggering system. That there's another session on curriculum reform happening at the very same time. So I'm expecting, we're not going to wait for them, okay, but we are going to maybe expect that there will be an influx of people in the middle of our session. And if that all happens at once, maybe we'll just pause and let them take a seat and then continue on our way, or give them a update on where things were. But let me just wait another, it seems like some people are thinking about whether they want to come in or not.
Because they're waiting for Lord Skidelsky.
We have to use the rule I used when I was giving a talk.
Yeah.
I've given a talk twice.
Yes.
Which is, I refuse to start speaking until there were 10 women.
Yes? Oh, well then, that's going to take a little while.
How often do you find you never start?
No, they're very effective actually. They round up people from the library.
Yeah.
It usually happens quickly.
Well, I'm going to implore you, okay, to put that rule in abeyance for the moment, so that we can get started. And I will get the session started now. This is a session on teaching economics, and I've been asked to chair it. Probably because I've been to some extent, my title at INET is the Director of Education Programs. Exactly what education programs are is something that INET seems to be still kind of figuring out. It's been trying various things, and you'll hear about some of that here. But I also have a personal story. I am a teacher, okay, and I have been teaching economics for 27 years now, believe it or not. It's my day job, and I think a lot of teachers think of it as their day job. It's what they do to make money so that they can then support their intellectual habit, and I think maybe that's the way it begins. But I would like to also just put on the table here at the beginning the sense in which teaching is thinking, okay? That new economic teaching and new economic thinking are closer to each other, that it's not just a matter of let the researchers figure out the new thinking and then we'll teach it. I think it's more integrated than that, that certainly is the way it is in my life, okay? So I tell you the story of this MOOC that you may know that I created, Money in Banking course that's on Coursera that is now got thousands and thousands of people taking it. This was a course that I taught to undergraduates for 15 years, okay, until it was done. And then we filmed it and published it, okay. But this course began with nothing. So a lot of the thinking that I've done, a lot of working it out, it was happening in front of the students, okay? And this is actually a very good, I put this forward as an example. Here's my former department chair who hired me, Duncan Foley. He used to say, teaching undergraduates keeps you honest. It makes you have to talk about the real world. They're just not that interested, okay, in arcane academic debates. And so in the introduction to my MOOC, I even say that this course came because these students are working on Wall Street. They're trading in the repo desk. And then their textbooks don't say anything about that. And so I said, okay, I guess I'll have to learn about this in order to teach them. And that turned out to be a wonderful new thinking experience as a teacher. If you find yourself and I'm speaking to young scholars here too. You find yourself teaching 5 classes a year. Try to teach classes about stuff you don't know about, but you do want to learn about. Okay, and that's a good chance. So three points, and then we'll get started. My role inside INET in pushing for something in the education area comes from the idea that we're not going to get much new economic thinking unless we get some new economic thinkers. Okay, that means helping people who want to be economic thinkers become economic thinkers. That if you try to do it by yourself, few geniuses maybe are able to do this, but they need help. They need direction to what are some resources that we can maybe build on. What are some mistakes that you don't have to repeat, and that sort of thing. I always tell young scholars, I can save you 30 years, the 30 years of wandering in the wilderness that I did. Okay. And if you happen to be following my path, I can save you 30 years. I can't save you 30 years anywhere else, but so that's one of our goals, is to help new economic thinkers become what they can be. I've already emphasized that teaching is thinking in my own experience, but I also want to say that for the young scholars, the people just getting started, that taking a job as a teacher, okay, is a way to develop your own thinking, and I think that I'll just encourage that. And then third, just to say, the INET's view on how best to do this is a work in progress. We have had some interventions at various stages. INET supported the making of this MOOC that I did. It supported the project that you're going to hear from Wendy Carlin. There was initially a curriculum committee that Bob Skidelsky and I sort of co-chaired. And we have a couple of other things. We have another MOOC in the process that Sanjay Reddy did for graduate school. We don't really know what to do with graduate school, okay? So we have some things at the introductory level, general economic education, some at the undergraduate level, and we're thinking about this. So I'm hoping to learn in this session, and from the contributions and from the conversation here, about where there might be the low-hanging fruit that we could easily access. So we have a very good panel here today. On my far right there, Wendy Carlin and Mark Lavoie and Bob Skidelsky, and Wilfred here as our discussant. I won't introduce them because they're in the program, so you can find their details there. And I'll just ask Wendy if you would just get started. You have some slides, I think.
And which do you press the microphone?
The red button. And when you press, I've discovered this. When you press, you cancel me. So you don't have to press to turn yourself off, because you will be turned off when somebody else.
Okay, excellent. Fantastic. So I'm going to talk about this project, the core project, which you can see up here. It's a new way to teach a first course in economics. We started the project about 18 months ago, and it's being piloted in classrooms in many parts of the world. So we have something concrete on the table or on the screen, and I'm going to talk through a number of aspects of it. So I guess what we're arguing is that we want to teach new topics, and the discussion that's just going on down the hall among the activists played a really important role in putting the new topics on the table, that we should be teaching about instability, we should be teaching about inequality, we should be teaching about environmental sustainability. And in the work of the core project, we make the case that in order to teach those new topics, we need new tools, or at least tools that are new to introduction to economics courses. We motivate all concepts with empirical evidence, and part of what's happened on this rather rapid process over the last year and a half has been that we've become much more conscious about the need to integrate new methods of teaching and learning with the new content that we are bringing to the table. So one way of putting a name to the kinds of questions that students are asking is to ask them. And this has been done regularly by one of the project members, Juan Camilo Cardenas at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. And every year on day one, he asks the students to write down what are the questions that they want answered. And this is the list, a sample from his students. We did the same thing at UCL this year. We gave students these cards. This was one of the kinds of answers. I want to understand the causes of the financial crisis. So these very fresh-faced students on the first day of their course come in full of enthusiasm for tackling these kinds of questions. So what is it? What have we done? We've been generously funded by INET to produce something. So what we've done is we've produced a free interactive ebook called The Economy, and actually our Italian collaborators have actually produced a physical version of this in Italian, and they're using that at present in Siena. It's the basis for a core principles of economics course. It's not a topics course, and this is, I think, very important to understand. So what we were trying to do was to produce a new way of teaching the introductory course. It does not assume that students have a conventional principles course alongside. So we couldn't kind of rest on the crutch of thinking, oh, well, I'll get all of that other stuff somewhere else. We had to really think very carefully about what we wanted our students to be able to do at the end of their introductory course. As I said, we use important economic questions, empirical evidence to motivate the development of modelling tools. And we feel that we'll have succeeded if students find economics interesting and useful and they want to learn more. If somehow the students coming out of this kind of course are excited by new ways of understanding the world, that they feel empowered, that they have really moved on from when they started on that day one with that list of questions, and that they feel more confident and comfortable talking with others, particularly non-economists, about how the world works. So how's it designed? We start with the great divergence and the great questions of economics, so long-run economic data from the past 1,000 years. And we start with the big questions, put them in front of the students, of growth, distribution, and sustainability. We move on to make a rather pointed question when we think about these long hockey stick-shaped charts that we've provided them with. The question is why England? Why was sustained growth of productivity first observed in England? Why in the 18th century? And that allows us to introduce some initial modelling, the Malthusian model and technological change, and the Schumpeterian model of the incentive to innovate. We introduce choices for every student of economics, certainly in the view of the group working on this project, has to have a way of thinking systematically about decision-making and decision-making under constraints, but we don't refer to Robinson Crusoe. We move very quickly from the individual to strategic interaction, so from the one person making decisions to the interaction among people, to social dilemmas and social preferences. We introduce it, if you think of that in the second week when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, we put on the table straight away that economists disagree, and what we are presenting as a way of thinking about the Industrial Revolution and introducing some simple modelling is, if you like, the Bob Allen view, but we make it clear that this is only a tiny snippet from the When Economists Disagree segment, and we outline many other different interpretations of the Industrial Revolution. So that gives you an example. This is what the free ebook looks like on the web, and you can download it to your phone or iPad. That just shows you the first 4 units. So in the first 4 weeks, students learn lots of facts about the world economy and its history. The way we've been teaching it, we actually test them on some of those facts, and they actually seem to quite like being comfortable with knowing them. They learn about social interaction before markets. They learn about the use of the experimental method in economics. They learn that economic models, right from the very beginning, can provide insight on very important, complex, giant-sized questions. And that's what I mean by this empowering sense that students get early on in a course of this kind. And they learn that economists disagree. So more of the logic. Something very unusual that would not be normally seen in an introduction to economics course. In the 5th week, we have a unit or a segment called Property, Contract and Power. And we link that to their introduction to strategic behaviour in the previous week. where they've learnt about rules of the game, understanding simple structure of a number of games, and they play games. And we lead into that as a way of thinking about institutions as rules of the game, both formal and informal. To efficiency and fairness, the role of private bargaining, what happens when there's the emergence of the state. And there's a unit much later on in the course on political economy, which talks about the evolution of capitalism and democracy. The firm is introduced, again, you can see that we've done all of this without introducing markets. So in the 6th week, the firm is introduced, and they are introduced to power relations within the firm, and the firm as setting the wage. So the power relationship between the employer and the worker. In the 7th week, the firm as a price setter emerges, and then in the 8th week, there are markets with many producers. So a very different pattern of introduction from the conventional one. Then we introduce a unit about market dynamics, and this is, if you like, very Hayekian. How do prices send messages? Are the messages the right ones? And there we begin to talk about processes of bubble formation, for example. And then onto market successes and failures. So by the end of a 10-week course, students view the world as one where market failures are all over the place, and they have a rather systematic way of thinking about a whole series of different ways in which markets fail, and we can think of as cases of externalities, where the action of one agent affects, or actor we call them, we don't refer to agents, affects that of others, and produces a whole series of different effects, whether that's an inadequate amount of training, whether it's typical externalities in pollution, or whether it's the question of work effort, as we discussed in the model of the firm. We, as well as economists disagreeing, it's quite useful for students to see that economists from very different centuries and very different political views can agree about things, and it's rather startling to compare the views of Coase and Marx about the firm and the nature of the firm. So let me move on to the later part of the course. Money, credit and banks emerges. We talk about fluctuations, inflation, unemployment, growth, and macro policy. But one of the big things that we've done in developing this course is to get rid of the distinction between micro and macro. There isn't a micro part and a macro part. We've laid the foundations, for example, in the way the firm is taught to move very naturally into macroeconomics without all the time having to bring out ad hoc assumptions about stickiness, for instance. I wanted to just put a little bit of, that's all kind of very general, but to somehow link what we've been working on in the project to the theme of the conference, and to talk about how we've taught economic inequality. So this is the first slide that appears for the students in the lecture on economic inequality. This is a very powerful picture. It's not two pictures stuck together. It's a single location in Brazil. This was from a lecture on inequality at UCL in February. We spent a lot of effort in building up the materials for the course, in creating visualizations of important economic concepts. So this skyscraper picture, as we think of it, is a way of thinking about income distribution, with countries ranked from the left to the right, from the poorest to the richest in terms of GDP per capita. And then for each country, you can look at the within-country inequality by decile, from the poorer at the bottom to the richer at the top. And this gives students a real sense of these two very important dimensions of inequality. And we can obviously just flip the picture so that they can see that the division in the photograph is picking up the the inequality, and you can see the richest 10% in Brazil to the right of the split in the diagram, in the photo. Right, so this came in February. The students started the course in the very first day of October. So the question is, where in the teaching of this course had they come across inequality before? Well, right at the very beginning, we introduced the concept of the Gini coefficient, and we do it using these pies that you can see there, just in a two-person interaction. We can calculate the Gini coefficient, and we can show the range of the data that we put before them then, which is between 0.2, the Gini in Denmark, and 0.6, the Gini in South Africa. We talk about varieties of egalitarian policies. That's that vividly coloured 2 by 2 in the centre. Some of this I'm hoping will kind of tempt you to actually register and get onto the material so that you can get behind what I'm flicking through very quickly. In experiments, so in Unit 4, when we introduced experiments, they took part in public goods games, for example, and we show results here. These are results from ultimatum games. Fairness and efficiency in both of those, the early units, we try to create a habit of thought of students that when they think about any economic allocation, it's both about who does what and who gets what. So we get them to think all the time and repeatedly as we work through the course, is the allocation efficient, the standard economic question, as it were, would there be mutual gains from moving to some other allocation? And then the other question, is the allocation fair? And something that's very challenging for us and that we need to work on is how better to teach our students to be able to talk analytically about normative questions, but we put them in front of them from the very beginning. Okay, I'll go through this quickly. This just shows other aspects of where questions of inequality and distribution come in through earlier parts of the course, including in the analysis of the credit market. In the from the model of the firm, the wage-setting firm, we have the wage curve. That's the empirical wage curve for the US at the top. This is used extensively in the macroeconomic development of the material that they've covered before they get to this discussion of inequality. So they're very familiar with the wage curve and with using that in the macro analysis. Here we wanted to provide a link using the same parties, in other words, the unemployed, employers and employees. How could we link that to the development of the concept of the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient, which they'd seen in many other contexts along the way. Why is disposable income so much more equally distributed in Nordic countries than the US, UK? I'm not going to work through these, but these are the questions that students were working through in the lectures. There's obviously a puzzle here. We want to introduce the role of policy. That's the diagram at the top, to differences in endowments and directly to inequality. So we do that by talking about intergenerational mobility. And you can see there's a very heavy use of data throughout the teaching. And second, the role of taxes and transfers. The question the students then begin to ask, what about all this taxation and redistribution? So again, we present some data. This is the long-term average inequality in disposable income on the horizontal and the GDP per capita growth since 1970 on the vertical. So this is very rich material, very rich empirical material for class discussions in smaller sections. And no. That's a no. It's absolutely not. It's a it's, if you like, some kind of trade-off. So it's divided.
So it's the hypothesis.
Yes. So it's looking at the trade-off between inequality and growth.
Regression line should go the other way around.
Yes. Okay. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'll move on. Just the last thing I was going to show you was the final week's assignment in the course, where we tried to connect models of macro finance and income distribution. This is the question the students were set. It's probably too small for people at the back to see, for which I apologise. The idea was that in the very last lecture, the students would get to use a whole bunch of tools that they'd accumulated over the course to think about 100 years of economic history. They were to use the foundations of forward-looking behaviour, combining it with balance sheets, which we lay considerable attention on, usually completely omitted from introductory courses. And these are this is a stylised interpretation of the Great Depression. This is applying their simple macro model to the events of the Great Depression and to the data. So again, placing a lot of effort and attention on generating the relevant data. Their exercise was to use that as a template to think about the financial crisis. So this is the 1980s, this is the housing boom, and this is the crisis. And they can, from this, they can infer how they should think about using the model they used in the Depression to talk about the crisis. And then we put the element of distribution by giving them some new data, some data on household wealth and debt, comparing the poorest and richest quintiles. So I think our hope is that a course along these lines builds demands for further improvements in the curriculum, that it recruits and retains a cohort of students who are interested in the world and how to make our economies work better. The update is that it's out in pilot in UCL, Bristol, Southampton, at Sciences Po. There are 1,200 students at Sciences Po at the moment working on this course, at Siena in Italian translation, etc. This is how we've done it. This has been a cooperative effort of about 25 academics from around the world who volunteered their time to write the course material. They've then taken it into the classroom in more or less flamboyant fashion. It's a process of review. It's out to review to students, teacher users, subject experts, potential users in workshops. We're then in the process of revising it, and we hope to have a 1.0 version by the autumn of 2017. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So our next speaker is Marc Lavoie, and 15 minutes.
Right, so my presentation will not be in the same spirit as the one that Wendy just did. I'm also the author of an introduction book to economics with my colleague Mario Saccareccia. But I'm not going to talk about this at all. I'm going to rather talk about this question here. Should heterodox economics be taught in economics departments, or is there any room for backwater economics? So backwater economics is an expression used by James Galbraith when he was arguing about the differences between saltwater economics and freshwater economics, and his idea was, well, there's also backwater economics, which is heterodox economics. I'm going to do a little bit of plagiarism here. I was in a session on capital flight yesterday, and one of the presenters, one of the speakers said, well, we have a problem with capital flight, but I'm not going to be able to offer answers. whereas Houston, the NASA, usually it's very important that they do provide a solution to a problem. So my problem is the lack of pluralism in teaching in economics departments, and so I will be unable to offer much solution. In fact, maybe the solutions are being offered in the other room with the session that started at 10 o'clock. I would say that this is a fitting city for such a session. As many of you know, the first call for a change in the way economics is being taught or in the theories that are being taught came in 2000 with a group of students here in Paris at the École Normale Supérieure. Then we had PEP's Economy, which is running the session, the 10 o'clock session, which started dealing with this in 2010, and that led to their call for more pluralism in economics. It's also a fitting site. Before coming here, I saw a report by the OECD claiming that group thinking sometimes precluded hearing diverse and diverging views. Prevalent economic models and analytical approaches often favored a silo approach in policymaking, preventing from fully grasping the complexity of the global economy and the interconnectedness between and within economies. So there are some people here at the OECD who, in a sense, are also calling for some kind of pluralism in economic thinking. It's a fitting time. This session is less than 3 months after our colleague Bernard Maris, who was a fairly well-known heterodox economist, he got assassinated in the offices of Charlie Hebdo by people who objected to freedom of speech. And I would say that in universities we are facing the same problem. There's not exactly freedom of speech because it has become more and more difficult in economics department to have alternative views. Maris complained of a sect, the obscurantism and fanatism of which are terrifying. It is not difficult to spot the Taliban behind the expert and a religious madness behind the folly of incentives. And here he was not talking about people in Afghanistan. Also, we had a quite fitting speaker at the inauguration of this conference on Wednesday night. Thomas Piketty, in his book, wrote what is here shown on the slide, which has not been very much emphasized, I think, where he was complaining about the discipline of economics, saying that it had a childish passion for mathematics and ideological speculation at the expense of historical research, and complaining that we are often too preoccupied with petty mathematical problems of interest only to the economist as such. It is true that sometimes it is also a problem for heterodox economists and not only for mainstream economists. I think we can say that everyone is in favor of pluralism in economics, or at least seems to be in favor of pluralism. And here I can distinguish 3 visions of pluralism. So first there is the team of Jean Tirole, who is the recent Nobel Prize winner, as you know. He believes there is quite enough pluralism, and those who wish for more are in fact promoting knowledge relativism, which is the antechamber of obscurantism. Then there's the team of Wendy Carlin, who argues that textbooks have to be reformed to incorporate the newest findings and insights in neoclassical economics, and I call this reform pluralism. And then finally there is Team Robert Skidelsky, who I think he will tell you more about it, wishes to have alternative theories, which would be more into the curriculum, history of economic thought, facts, and that would be what I would call radical pluralism. I would say that to a large extent our mainstream colleagues are like Parisians. In France, if you dare criticize France and the French, you better have a French accent. Otherwise, you're in deep trouble. And even better, you better have a Parisian accent, because if you have an accent from the south of France, you may not be taken very seriously. I think the same happens with neoclassical economics. There are many neoclassical economists, and here I have a list of them: Robert Solow, Blanchard, Beuter, Krugman, John Kay, who is on the advisory board here at the INET, Alan Kerman, even Lawrence Summers have criticized mainstream economics. But when as I say there, when the writings of heterodox economists are being brought to their attention, usually they just disparage them. They dismiss their originality or their relevance or their scientificity. For instance, Paul Krugman, when the work of Wynne Godley was brought to his attention, said that it was just old hat stuff, whereas Paul Krugman himself likes to refer to the ISLM model as being the next best thing that was ever invented. And others refer to heterodox economics as being phlogiston theories or creationism theories. So internal criticism seems to be quite legitimate, but external criticism is not. I would say that to some extent this is what some have called gas lighting. Many mainstream economists say that we just don't know what we're talking about when we are criticizing mainstream economics, that we haven't read the latest research. And they usually put together heterodox economists with non-economists. And they often say that, well, basically we are attacking a straw man, that everything we are worried about has already been discussed in some way with some reasonable modifications in more advanced research. So some call this gas lighting because some of you may have heard of the movie Gaslight, where the husband was flicking the gaslight in the house, telling his wife, Ingrid Bergman, that these flickers were figments of her imagination. So it's like us. What we are criticizing would be figments of our heterodox imagination. I think it's fair to say that the core program that Wendy Carlin just described as one of its objectives to close the gap between what economists now know and what we teach undergraduates, because the curriculum is increasingly removed from what economists now know. In fact, it's a quote of yours.
I think it's okay.
Yes. So roughly speaking, there is no need to really reform the curriculum. All we need to do is play around at the edges. And this is what David Colander calls introducing the leading edge of what I call orthodox dissenters into the textbooks. So that's reform pluralism. John Davis, who made a presentation here, described this as an increasing tolerance for new approaches within the mainstream, combined with a continuing shared intolerance toward heterodox economics. So, for instance, what will be said by our mainstream colleagues is that, well, there's a lot of pluralism right now, and they will say that contemporary research is providing a cross-paradigm fertilization of ideas. through, and they will say, well, we now have game theory in our textbooks, we have new behavioral economics, experimental economics, new institutional economics, transaction cost economics, new growth theory that goes beyond the solo model, environmental economics, and so on. And it is true. So what we really have is more pluralism within neoclassical economics, but less so outside of the mainstream or outside of orthodox economics. Another way of saying this, if we're looking strictly speaking at macroeconomics, is to say, well, there's a lot of pluralism already. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of controversies. You have the point of view of new classical economics. You have the point of view of new Keynesian economics. I just read the 2015 intermediate macroeconomics textbook by Wendy and her co-author, and they have a version of new Keynesian economics that they call the three-equation model, which is slightly different, from the new Keynesian standard model. Lots of discussion about the fiscal theory of the price level. There are still monetarists out there who talk about market monetarism, or saying that instead of targeting the price level or the inflation rate, we should be targeting nominal GDP. So, that's one way of responding, of saying, well, there is a lot of pluralism already in macroeconomics. And I would say that this just doesn't go far enough. That sprinkling a bit of economic history or history of economic thought, showing how much progress we have done, is just not enough. And so the problem from my perspective is that reform pluralism does not extend enough to other traditions, such as post-Keynesian economics, which is my approach, or Marxian economics, or old institutional economics, or evolutionary economics, or for those who live here in France, the French regulation school, which is a mixture of all these things. Also, sometimes it is, going through readings, blogs by famous mainstream authors, I would say that a radical reform of the curriculum is unlikely, because our mainstream colleagues don't seem to realize that heterodox economists have something more than just a critique of mainstream economics to offer. I mean, we do have a positive message. We do have our own theories. It's not only a critique. And Fred Lee, with whom I have co-edited a book last year, and who died a few months ago, once wrote that if by any bad luck neoclassical economics were to disappear completely from the surface of the earth, well, I certainly don't hope that this will happen, this would leave heterodox economics utterly unaffected, because heterodox economics has its own agenda, its own issues, its own methodological approaches, as well as its own models and formalization. So we also make contributions to economic theory and to our understanding of economic phenomena. And I think I'm not going to go through this as I see that my time is running out, but I think that during the financial crisis and even before the financial crisis, we had a lot to say that turned out to be highly relevant with respect to the financial crisis. I mean, everybody knows about Minsky's financial fragility hypothesis, but all those macroeconomic paradoxes that we have emphasized in the past turned out to occur during the financial crisis, and the fact that there is hysteresis. There was a presentation by Steve Fazzari on the first day, well, on Thursday, showing how much of a fall the consumption level in the U.S. Had taken and has not gone, consumption in the U.S. just has not gone back on trend. So this is a good example of hysteresis that post-Keynesians have emphasized. So the conclusion, should heterodox economics move out of economics? We are first and foremost economists. This is obvious. But in most countries, the work of heterodox economics is either perceived as bad economics or something else than economics. I don't know, social economics or something like that. And INET is making an enormous and worthwhile effort to promote radical pluralism, in particular with all this work with the Young Scholars Initiative. But then it's the next step that gets me worried. Will all these young scholar initiatives, will they manage to get a position in an economics department? So is it still possible for heterodox economics to survive or to keep striving in economics department? And the question then is, well, if not, is there a plan B? And should instead heterodox economists try to move on to other departments or create their own alternative discipline? A good example of this is international political economy, that has been quite successful and has its own journal, which is highly ranked. And some of you may have heard of the efforts of the French Association for Political Economy, AFEP, in creating a new unit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And our last speaker before our discussant is Bob Skidelski. The floor is yours, 15 minutes.
And I think I need something to
Put the red button.
red button in it and push it.
No. Here. There you go.
Yeah, and what about?
The red button. Sorry, the
green button. Now the green button.
Yeah, I want to get it back.
Oh.
Okay, well, we're all right.
The red button moves you back. Here, this one.
Okay.
I think that's maybe your first slide.
Yeah.
I think that's your first slide.
Actually, there was a sort of one, but that's the first substantive one. Well, in 1844, John Stuart Mill wrote an essay called Some Unsettled Questions in Political Economy, 1844, that is. I want to talk necessarily more briefly, on some unsettled questions in macroeconomics. And I want to stick to macroeconomics because that, of course, necessarily affects the way these unsettled questions affects the way we should teach macroeconomics. Now, macroeconomics is in a mess. It has been rendered so by the huge economic collapse of 2008, 2009, and the very anemic recovery we've had from it. As a result, macroeconomic policy is all over the place. Monetary policies in the air. There was an excellent discussion yesterday on central banking and the collapse of the one target, one instrument model of central banking, but little agreement yet on what what the post-crash mandate of central banking should be, what prudential banking is needed, and so on. More fundamentally, what sort of financial system should we have that can save us from some of these horrors in the future? Economists are divided about quantitative easing. They are divided about its transmission mechanism, its potency, its legacy. Economists are divided about the role of fiscal policy. The golden rules set up in the 2000s for stabilizing fiscal policy have been smashed, and we don't know what to put in their place, or indeed agree about the respective roles of fiscal and monetary policy in the design of macro policy. Are deficits in a slump good or bad? Is there a safe limit to the national debt? These are certainly unsettled questions, and in our macro we shall certainly have to find a place for issues of inequality and distribution. We can't any longer treat these purely as allocation issues. The distribution of income has consequences for the level of demand, and Wendy referred to this. And finally, international macro, global imbalances, responsibility for adjustment between surplus and deficit countries, fixed versus floating exchange rates, the impending implosion of the Eurozone, which we all look forward to in slow motion. All these things are unsettled questions in macroeconomics and, in fact, therefore, unsettled questions about how we teach the subject. But let me start, then, with two famous post-war orthodoxies, which I label Samuelsonian and Lucasian. Well, this is Samuelson. I think we've had a slide in another room, I think. The spectre of a repetition of the depression of the 1930s has been reduced to negligible proportions. Great. Macroeconomics, in this original sense, has succeeded. Its central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes and has, in fact, been solved for many decades. Robert Lucas in 2003. Samuelson thought we would have no more depressions because governments would use Keynesian tools to prevent them. And Lucas, 30 years later, said we'd have no more depressions because governments wouldn't use Keynesian tools to try to prevent them. Both policy models collapsed shortly after these statements justifying them. Now, there's now no agreed policy model. This is the first justification for pluralism. At least as teachers, we can no longer hope to say, as Lucas is said to have said to his class, we have come to Keynes. We don't need to spend more than 10 minutes on him because we know he doesn't work. Here, have a look at the two views of macroeconomy represented in this simple diagram. Where do we think the macroeconomy normally is? On or inside its production possibility frontier? Does the diagram capture any useful bits of reality? Perhaps not if you're a business cycle theorist and believe equilibrium is a fanciful construction. Is it even useful as a teaching aid? The answer is surely yes, because it captures very clearly the current political debate between austerity and expansion. Consider this. For about a year and a half after the great crash of 2008, we thought we were living in a Keynesian world. The economy was sliding downwards and governments threw everything they could at it. The slide was stopped. We would only have a Great Depression and not a we'd only have a Great Recession and not a Great Depression. And in that sense, of course, Samuelson and Lucas may have been right. We may now be in a position to prevent any recurrence of the Great Depression. But then, early in 2010, something peculiar happened. We were suddenly back in the Lucasian world. Ricardian equivalence reigned. Multipliers were zero. Quantitative easing was switched off. Austerity was the order of the day. And this, mind you, when OECD economies were still well below their pre-crash levels. In the United Kingdom, we've just very recently regained our pre-crash level of GDP. How do we explain this flip over? And shouldn't we try to explain it to students? Is it enough to say that central banks and governments became alarmed about the size of their balance sheets and therefore, naturally, had to put the engines into reverse? So what is the relationship between the balance sheet of a government and the balance sheet of the economy? These are matters which are unsettled. But we have to say, if we want to, be thought of as teachers, we have to actually try and answer some of these questions, certainly discuss them. And a third unsettled issue, which the slump plainly threw into relief, was the question of expectations. Evidently, models of rational expectations cannot easily explain the great banking collapse of 2008. Hence, of course, there's a very great interest in behavioral models and other extensions of these rational decision-making models. But now we're back to quasi-normal times. The very models which fared so poorly have come rushing back to explain the outcomes of fiscal policy. For example, according to Professor Alesina of Bocconi University, Milan, cutting down welfare payments causes economies to grow. And that wasn't a micro argument about efficiency, it was a macro argument. The Alesina effect was supposed to operate through the expectations channel, and a rational expectations channel. Do we believe this? Certainly lots of studies have failed to detect an Alesina effect. Conversely, economists and government advisors and pundits have been arguing that expansionary fiscal policy must fall foul of Ricardian equivalence. Do governments accept any of that nonsense? Of course they do. They did. They use the terms. So there is a flow from very simple, I call them for short Lucasian economics, but that's not fair to Lucas. But very direct flow from these kinds of economics taught in universities to the pronouncements of ministers. Now, I don't know what the intermediaries are that connect these two things is a matter of enormous interest, and it tells us a lot about economics and power. But we nevertheless need to be aware of them. Because do we really believe that when governments sell bonds, the buyers increase their savings by an equivalent amount? Do we really believe that? But that seems to be one of the assumptions that policymakers are making. Now, a third point, for post-crash students, the main obstacle to getting a handle on such debates is economics' methodological authoritarianism. And you actually referred to Professor Tirole, and I've got a bit of a quotation from him. It is inconceivable to me that France would recognize two communities within the same discipline. The quality of research ought to be appraised on the basis of publications, compelling each researcher to an assessment of his peers. This constitutes the very foundation of scientific progress in all disciplines. Trying to sidestep such judgments encourages relativism. So, self-proclaimed heterodox economists have to comply with this fundamental principle of science. Now, it's too late to protest against academic specialization, though one may want to say that in many areas of the discipline, diminishing returns have long set in. But the point is that what Professor Tirole sets up as a single scientific assessment standard is very, very largely simply mathematics. The test of economic competence is the ability to set up and manipulate equational models and deploy the appropriate econometric techniques for empirical investigation. To think like an economist is to think mathematically, full stop. No other test is applied at all. And that was not true for nearly the whole of the history of economics. Very few of the great economists, they were able to think mathematically, but they were able to think in other ways as well. And many of their insights did not derive from the characteristic mathematical way of thinking. And of course, this test is an absurd stipulation. For most areas of economic policy, educated common sense educated, that is, by wide reading and knowledge of the facts and institutions, should be the main stipulation for competence in the subject, the main basis for decision making. And Keynes expressed this very nicely when he said that he hoped one day economists would become as useful as dentists. There's lots we could discuss about that remark. So when we educate students of economics, what do we think we're educating them to be? Technicians? But that's to treat the world like a machine. Some economics should be like this, but by no means all of it. And I think we have to accept another point, that mathematical formalism is a huge barrier to the integration of economics with other social science disciplines to which many pay lip service to. It constitutes, this formalization constitutes, in fact, economics' claim to uniqueness and superiority. It is also the main tool for selecting economists, excluding from the profession any who either by choice or incapacity do not do the maths. I agree that one can have powerful mathematical intuitions. Of course one can, and economics, the history of economics is full of it. But of course one can have powerful non-mathematical intuitions which are extremely valuable. What is the appropriate level of mathematics? This is much less frequently discussed, but it ought to be. I mean, everyone says, of course you need mathematics, maybe there's too little mathematics, or the problem isn't that we have too much mathematics, it is that it is not being correctly applied or appropriately used. But the fact of the matter is, those that can do the maths make good progress in their careers, the ones that can't don't and go off and do something else. So I think there's a huge barrier to entry, and it's something we need to think about clearly as teachers. And my last point, really, an equally serious methodological problem that besets macroeconomics is the attempt to construct it from micro foundations. And the crucial foundation of micro foundations is methodological individualism. This is the habit of treating individuals, their choices and decisions as the sole units of analysis. An economic world made up of rational Crusoes, all maximizing their utilities and expunged of all ethical, social, biological, psychological, anthropological attributes. Robert Lucas sees himself as constructing a mechanical artificial world populated by interacting robots that is capable of exhibiting behavior, the gross features of which resemble those of the actual world. Well, that's, I think, a quite accurate description of how most economists do economics. But whether such a world does actually exhibit the gross features of the actual world is exactly the point in question. It's interesting how early in his life Keynes understood that society was not a collection of interacting robots, but an organic unity. And this comes from a little paper he wrote when he was 19, I think. Well, one possible implication of this is that you should start your economics from macro and work the causation downwards rather than from micro and try to work the causation upwards. That's a very big issue. And I'm going to end at that point by saying that we have got into the peculiar position of teaching our students macro in part 2, while part 1 implicitly denies any need for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you can see how people are interested in this subject because they can't stay within 15 minutes. But we do have 25 minutes left for discussion, and to kick us off with that discussion is Wilfried Altsinger, and then we'll open to the floor. Please.
Thank you very much. May I have the slides, please? Thank you. So it's a difficult task to make brief comments to all these three presentations. Just let me say first a few words about myself. I'm working at the University of Economics and Business at Vienna, and I'm responsible there for the economic policy program. And moreover, we do have a very active student organization there, or not student organization, student movement, who actually do have a conference on pluralism economics. And I'm not responsible for their conference, but I appreciate very, very much their contributions to which have an impressive impact on at least some minor changes in our program. And that's the reason why I'm also trying to give, I've been invited to comment on the papers here. I will start with the paper from Mark. It's a very well-written, long paper, already finalized paper, which I've got 2 weeks ago. He is speaking about the primacy of the mainstream economics, and we have heard all his arguments, and I will be as quick as possible. The superiority on textbooks is certainly on the, let's say, mainstream economics side. How new vacancies are settled, or how new jobs are get acquainted, is certainly one of the main topics. If we want to change anything in the economics program, then I think it's more or less the most important thing to discuss about how vacancies are settled. We have also heard about the distribution of the private and public funds, and about the reference process and the core journals, the importance of the core journals, which finally ends in some kind of inbreeding. Not only since we are here at the OECD headquarters, I just want to mention and to emphasize that these organizations, the OECD, the World Bank, and also more or less in particular the IMF, are much further in the economic thinking than our profession is it itself. And I think that's really, to some large extent, a pity, but as we have heard many arguments why this is the case. They're much further on the road to discuss, Okay, thank you very much. Okay. They are much further discuss the relevant policy issues from many different perspectives, not only from the economic side, but also from the political sides. And therefore, I do appreciate what they have already brought into this discussion. And if you read the newest papers about inequality from the OECD, or if you read the speeches from Lacan, then I think they're much further to capture the main economic issues and to try to find some solutions. Thank you. Mark has mentioned in his papers that there are two currents within the INET, INET population, or within the INET team, the team Skidelsky, which he has called in his paper Promoting Alternatives, and the team Carlin about the mild transformation. We have heard both the statements, and I don't want to comment on it any further, since as an outsider I can't say too much. I will rely only on the 4 pages which I've got from the INET institution 4 days ago from Bob Skidelsky. And the main points there is the critique on the methodological authoritarianism, which the quotation from Jane Dyrell said more or less everything. The second point, I think we will agree more or less everybody inside the audience here. Economics is not a natural science, but a social science. And whenever we are discussing about economic thoughts and economic history, then everybody knows that the large change took place in the middle of the 19th century. If we read the work and the books from John Stuart Mill or Adam Smith, they were never concentrated only on the economic issues. They also were, most of them were philosophers, and they also have always include the political aspects of this of these issues. It's important, and Wendy Carlin has shown us that it can be made in her book to include, to bring the micro and the macro perspectives together. We know that the fallacy of composition is a very important thing. Individuals are not only passive agents, they are very active, interactive agents. Therefore, we have to need a dynamic perspectives and not only a static one. At the macro level, there are many different aims which economic policy should fulfill: employment versus price stability, and they also do have many side effects and repercussions which should be taken into account in a proper analysis. Finally, as Bob said, the purpose of the economics is to discover fresh truths, how societies as an organic unity is working and changing. And as he mentioned already, in particular in this respect, an interdisciplinary approach is a sine qua non, is the most important thing. Wendy Carlin wrote me an email also a week ago that she will focus only on, or mainly on the chapter 19, and I have to admit that is the only chapter which I have read in full, and I will in particular focus on this chapter 19. Certainly a very well-written introduction, problem-oriented, sound introduction to inequality indices. The description about the Gini coefficient I found rather striking or interesting for the bachelor program. What is done in this chapter in particular is it stimulates open question and it stimulates a broader discussion. What I want to mention is profound theories are missing. So probably that might be the case if it is an introduction for the bachelor program. And also a small slide which has been presented by Wendy. I can show you also on this slide. What I think is a rather positive issue at this slide, that it enforces the discussion. I would not fully agree with the discussion which is presented in this chapter, and I also would not fully agree with the direction of the arrows. In particular, what I think is that what you can see in the middle of this graph, the differences in endowments, has also a huge impact on the changes of technology and has huge impact on the institutions. And in what respect I do think it has an impact is that the endowment structure is very, very important for the bargaining game in the economy in general. And I think that this issue, the Bauern economics, is missing not only in this chapter, it's also missing, I would argue, in many, many discussions in the conference here. And my contribution, my own contribution to this discussion is just to give you a hint to a rather well-known economist, an Austrian economist, Kurt W. Rothschild, who died only 5 years ago. And he has written on the issues which we are actually discussing in this session quite a lot. I'm sure that the INET institution will publish, will present the slides publicly. I have also all these papers linked to the original papers, and we also have produced a rather newly homepage about Kurt Rothschild, about his life and about his full literature, 250 papers, all of them are linked. And you can, in particular, to have at home concerns, and in particular to the young students, I would highly suggest to have a look at this page, and in particular on this 4 papers. Rothschild was, and I think that's important also for our discussion, he has a very, very long life. He lived 96 years. He lived 96 years. He was born in 1912 in Austria, and he was educated, if you want to say that, in the so-called Red Vienna. And there he has acquainted quite a lot of the so-called Marxist theory, not at the university, not at school, in the circles which have been established at that time. Secondly, there was no study of economics. He studied law, but within the study of law, there was a large part where they were taught in economics, and what kind of economics have been taught at that time. It was between 1933 and 1938, the so-called Austrian school, which is not directly a neoclassical theory, but it is to a very large extent is working with neoclassical instruments. And as he was a Jew, he has to flew in 1938 to Scotland, and there he was acquainted with the new Keynesian theory. So I just want to mention it, since if you read his papers, all his papers are very eclectic papers, and he has a huge box of tools which has included not only Keynesian theory, but also neoclassical theory and to some extent Marxist theory. And he has tried to establish to every problem which he did write a paper, tried to find those tools which fits him most to explain some specific issues which he was acquainted with. And I think this box of tools is something which is rather necessary, but it's not really easy to get the full knowledge of all these 3 different theories which I've mentioned here. I want to say one word about the power in economics. Okay, I will be finally. So he said, or he has explained in one paper very much the completely change of the world, which is due to maybe called globalization. You have a tripartite system during the 60s, the employer, the employees, organization, and the state, and you have a huge influence from the business sector to the state. But during the last 3 to 4 decades at least, this power game has changed completely, in particular due to the globalization, which was mainly driven by multinational enterprises, a word which I also didn't hear at this conference all the time. And in what way is it related to the main speakers which we have heard on the openings at the opening session on Wednesday evening? One quotation from Thomas Piketty: broadly speaking, the central fact is that the return on capital often inextricably combines elements of true entrepreneurial labor, of pure luck, or outright theft. If you just read this not very many times cited paragraph, then you can see that here there are many, many different possibilities how you can improve or how you can achieve a proper rate of return on the invested capital. And Joe Stiglitz is more or less talking about the same issue when he speaks about rent-seeking. Rent-seeking he defines as using political and economic power to get a larger share of the national pie rather than to grow the national pie. And the final slide which I want to show you here is 2 quotations, one from Kurt Rothschild. I've learned to see the world and its economic aspects not just as a harmonious progress of mankind, which obviously it was not, but as a dynamic process of interacting interests and conflicts of power and exploitation. And the final quotation from Bertrand Russell, who has got the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1950, but he was a philosopher, a historian, an economist to some extent. He writes, economic as a separate science is unrealistic. and misleading if taken as a guide in practice. It is one element, a very important element, it is true, in a wider study, the science of power. And if I want to say a final word, if you read the book from Piketty, I think he is not only a proper economist, but he includes also historical aspects and political aspects. And I think this in particular makes the reading of this book rather challenging and rather interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we do not have a huge amount of time. We have 7 minutes here. I think maybe the best procedure would be, there are many people here who want to say some things, to just let them, to have a number of questions and then to stop it and let the panelists have any final remarks if they do. But I'm sure we all want to hear the remarks that have been stimulated by this really very fascinating combination of presentations here. So let me just see where I have here, say, Mateus. Let's get them just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? Please.
Thank you, Perry. So as the token mathematician in the audience, I'm forced to disagree with Robert Skidelsky that the dividing line in methodology is if somebody does the mathematics or doesn't. I would say the dividing line is if you follow a equilibrium, intertemporal utility maximization or not. And sometimes these two things go together, but most often they don't. Myself, Steve Keen, Peter Scott, many others, they write very mathematical papers, and we cannot get it nowhere close to mainstream journals because we don't have equilibrium, intertemporal utility maximization. And on the other hand, there are, Summers, Krugman, even Tihol, many mainstream economists who write very easy mathematical papers, high school math with a little bit of first-year calculus, and those are considered very insightful because they do utility optimization and equilibrium.
Thank you. And if we could, that's perfect length.
Thank you.
Next, yes.
Yeah. My name is Andreas Wörgert, and I'm an OECD economist. And of course, I noted with satisfaction that there is Willi Altzinger thinking that we, like others, are ahead of the curve. But OECD, like other international organizations, we only can be as effective as the tools that we are using are. And among the most important tools that we use is economics. Yeah? And therefore, my simple question to the audience, to the panel, is how can heterodox economics become more orthodox in the sense of being more relevant for policy recommendations, which is what is our business. I mean, we cannot make recommendations on the basis of heterodox economics, because this would mean that we would request policymakers to carry out social experiments, to see whether this recommendation works or doesn't work. When we make a recommendation, we must be convinced that this is the best recommendation to make. And for that, we use the best meaning, most convincing economics that is available. And the more of it, the better. And therefore, make heterodox economics more orthodox in the sense of being more useful for policy recommendations. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I wanted to sort of ask the speaker more directly about one dimension which I felt was missing, because sort of in your presentation, it always seemed like that what was missing to me is the self-understanding of what it is we do when we teach economics, right? Because what you talked a lot about is economics is just about describing external reality. But teaching economics also informs the very nature of our students, what it means to be human, what is society, all these other issues. So I guess, and then that, call it reflexivity, performativity. So I was wondering if any of the panelists maybe we first need a different self-understanding of what it is we do as economists before we then make different teaching material.
Me too. No, you were first.
Both.
You were first.
My question is very short as it relates to his question. What I feel what could add to our understanding of how to teach economics would be to take into account what I experience at my university, that not all students are actually interested in becoming great economists, but they see economics or the study of business as a path to having a good life by having a career. And I feel that is a huge problem, because we need to inspire students to wanting to understand what he just mentioned. And I would like to hear your take on that.
I just want to amplify what Matthias Grasselli said, but I speak as a non-mathematician. We should be very careful about dealing with the problem as being that it's all math. Bad mathematical models are bad, not mathematical models are bad. Joe Stiglitz yesterday afternoon showed us again, as he has done again and again and again, how extraordinary intuition embodied in a tiny little toy model can reveal something useful and meaningful about how the world doesn't work very well. So I would urge that to be taken into account.
I'm John Kay, and Mark had correctly identified me as a reform pluralist, and I want to explain why. And Robert produced that famous Keynes quote about economists ought to be like dentists. And I want to make the point that there are no heterodox dentists, or at any rate, I don't believe anyone in this room patronizes one. More generally, there is medicine and there is alternative medicine, and most alternative medicine is flaky, not all is. And it is true that conventional medics, doctors, are extremely resistant to absorbing what is actually useful in alternative medicine. But actually, good doctors are not. Good doctors are concerned with what works, whatever it came from. And as was said over there, they will absorb into their day-to-day toolkit whatever they find works. And that's why I'm a reform pluralist. And for me, pluralism in economics means being receptive to any insight from any discipline, from any place, that actually enhances our knowledge of the world. And that's why I think Tirole is right to say there should only be one community of economists. But of course, where he is wrong is that we currently have a situation which is much worse than medicine in terms of the resistance of a group of people who control journals and curriculum and curricula to accepting good ideas wherever they come from and being willing to reject treatments in one case or policies in the other on the basis of evidence that they don't work. That's what we need, not a variety of different schools of economics and exposing students to theory A, theory B, and going in for the knowledge relativism that Tirole rightly criticized.
I want to underline Wilfred's comment that power should be essential to any teaching of economics. And I want to add something. My name is Sam Bowles. I'm from the Santa Fe Institute, and I'm also part of the CORE project. A focus on power comes naturally from any microeconomic framework in which credit markets don't clear, labor markets don't clear. Then how is the outcome determined in these non-clearing markets? Well, power is essential. It's not introduced ex cathedra. It comes directly out of the basic economics which is being done. And I also want to assure Wilfred that power is far from being absent. We have an entire chapter early in the curriculum called Property, Contract, and Power. We clearly couldn't do without it once we adopt an adequate model of factor markets, and of course a lot of other things in which bargaining power comes in.
Okay, so I'm sure there's many more people wanting to say things, but we are at 12:30. If the panel wishes to respond, I want to give them a chance, but I'm also informed that George Soros is speaking in room 1 and that I just send you all there immediately when we close. Okay, so just have that in mind. Wendy, do you want to just come through the panel here?
I haven't got anything more. I think I've had my chance. And what John and Sam said is perfectly reflects the position I would take.
Well, I just like, well, maybe a couple of comments. First, on the issue of heterodox economics and mathematics, there are heterodox economists who are using a lot of mathematics. There's a lot of heterodox economists who are doing empirical work, econometric work, but they start with different assumptions. So the variables that will be included into the regression will be different. And so they very often they come to different conclusions. This is to respond to what has been said by the OECD. I'm a little bit surprised that the persons at the OECD are saying that they are basing their advice on evidence, because there's been a lot of evidence that more flexibility in labor markets is not improving the situation whatsoever. And despite that, the OECD has kept repeating this kind of advice. And just to come back to what Robert Skidelsky has said about Alesina, who has claimed that by reducing welfare payments, that this would increase employment, it sounds like a very surprising statement, but this is exactly what the OECD is recommending. And if one goes to Wendy's second-year textbook on macroeconomics, which is, by the way, an excellent textbook in which I highly recommend if you are in the mainstream. In her book, if there is a reduction in welfare payments, it will shift the so-called wage setting curve, and it will lead to a higher level of employment, indeed. So, you know, all these mainstream models are linked to the policies which are being put forward by the mainstream organizations, and this is why these organizations need to have a different viewpoints, heterodox viewpoints, so that when they meet in a room, then there are alternative viewpoints being expressed.
Yeah, I just want to answer on one point on maths, and you raised it and Bill Janeway did. I mean, I think what is one really claiming about this? That maths has made economics better than it was when Smith was writing, Ricardo was writing, Mill was writing, Marshall was writing. What have we got? What's the value added? I mean, we've had much more formalization. Is one saying that they would have done it that way had they had the maths at the time, or do we are we really saying that they understood that lots of things that they wanted to say could not be said mathematically? And you've just got the whole history of the subject. Most great economists did not write mainly in mathematical models. You're really, I think, reduced to saying that either that was a defect in the maths of the day, and had they actually been able to, they would have done so. I don't believe that's true. I'm not against maths. I think maths has a part to play. But if you take Bertrand Russell's view, which is that economics ought to be actually part of the power of science, a part of the management of societies, maths cannot play as dominant a part in economics as it now does. It just can't. And it's a vested interest.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and thank you all. Thank our panel.